Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest is an award-winning filmmaker best known for documentaries focusing on health, mental health, environmental, and social justice issues. Some of her best-known works include her feature documentary entitled Toxic Trespass, Children's Health and the Environment, Toxic Beauty, and Girls' Night Out. Her latest film adds to the recent revelations here in Canada of brutal legacies of neglect, abuse, violence, and the trauma inflicted on our most vulnerable citizens. We know about the tragic and horrendous plight of Indigenous children in residential schools. We've learned what's happened to many children at the hands of Catholic priests. We've heard about the treatment of elderly people isolated in nursing homes. And now, thanks to our guest, we're learning about the shameful and horrific treatment of disabled, institutionalized children in her multi-award-winning documentary entitled Unloved, HURONIA'S Forgotten Children. The movie takes us on an intensely personal journey of the filmmaker's quest to uncover the mystery of what happened to her two long-deceased, intellectually disabled half-brothers, who were rarely talked about after they were institutionalized in the 1950s at a government-run facility in Orillia, Ontario, first opened in 1876 and called the Ontario Hospital School. It was neither a hospital nor a school. In 1945, it was renamed the Huronia Regional Center, and it operated until it was finally closed in 2009 after having held captive tens of thousands of vulnerable children and youth who suffered dehumanizing treatment. That institution forms part of the immense tragedy of Canada's and the 20th century's disastrous treatment of intellectually disabled children. In the film, we meet a number of survivors who speak frankly about the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse and trauma they endured, and the landmark class action lawsuit they brought against the Ontario government, which was finally settled in 2013. The film, written and directed by our guest, will be televised in Canada on the CBC network on Sunday, January 29th, and will then be available on CBC Gem. Here's the trailer.
Remember Mom and Dad telling me that I was going to go to the hospital for people that are retarded. Mom let go of my hand and the nurse with the cap took me in. I was so afraid.
The first name was the Orillia Lunatic Asylum for Chronic Patients.
From the very beginning, Huronia was notoriously known for its terrible conditions.
It became the Orillia Asylum for Idiots.
The sadism that occurred at Huronia was absolutely the norm.
Went there in isolation. They broke my teeth, they broke my legs.
We had a bunch of psychopaths taking care of us.
I was terrified.
They drugged you up. They drugged you up. Who would believe me? Who would believe any of us?
It was a deeply loveless place. There are spaces that tell people that they are unloved and unlovable at every turn.
Two half-brothers. Both go to the same place at 3 years. None of us kids knew Alfie or Lewis. No one spoke of them.
Look at that. So that's what he looked like.
He came in perfectly healthy.
Our brother Alfie was found dead in his bed. He was 23.
They murdered him, in my opinion. You don't let a kid die. You're supposed to take care of them.
All those years from 1971 to 2009, the government had been told to close the place. It's a mess.
And in 1963, they passed standards North America-wide. Huronia completely failed to comply with these standards.
The court approved a $35 million settlement in a class action suit.
It was never about the money.
The only thing that pisses me off, I want to be able to say, this is what you guys did to me.
Many of them regret they never went to court to tell their story.
So we need to learn from that.
We felt that it was important to have survivors tell their story through this monument.
If you don't talk about your story, nobody will listen.
Our guest was the co-chair and a founding member of the Hot Docs International Documentary Film Festival. She was the national executive chair of the Documentary Organization of Canada, and she's the former editor and publisher and currently a columnist at Point of View magazine. And if that weren't enough, she's currently studying psychoanalysis. I'm delighted to welcome Barri Cohen to our show. Barri, thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's a real pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Barri, I must tell you that I was absolutely shocked by your movie because although there was news coverage about the settlement of the class action lawsuit back in 2013, I don't think the public was given much detail about exactly what had been going on at the Huronia Regional Center. So your film is a huge revelation, isn't it?
Well, I hope it is. The motive for me doing it, in fact, was when I heard about some of the details of the class action in 2013, because my sister had called me to tell me, you know, have you read the news? Have you heard about this? And I was sent on this journey of discovery because I didn't. I thought to myself, as soon as I read the statement of claim that had been posted by the lawyers on their website from the plaintiffs, led by Marie Slark and Patricia Seth, survivors who led the class action, they're in the film, I was floored. And I thought, I bet you nobody in Ontario, let alone Canada, really knows about this place. And I started asking friends and colleagues, and some people remembered as children hearing about a place that their parents would use as a threat. If you don't behave, we're going to send you to Orillia, which is the town about 150 kilometers outside of Toronto where the institution was. So I would hear stories from friends like, oh, I heard about that place. And they didn't know its name. In fact, it was Ontario Hospital School. And then in the 70s, it was renamed Huronia. But they didn't know. It was just Orillia. We're going to send you to Orillia. It was like this boogeyman place. So it kind of had a certain resonance of something scary, something unknown, because it was out of sight, out of mind. And which is what is very typical of these institutions, in fact, throughout the Western world. So I, too, had the same feeling you did, that very few people probably knew at all about this. And that told me there's a story here.
Well, the sad reality when a lawsuit is settled is that there is no trial. And so the plaintiffs don't get an opportunity to tell their stories in a public forum. And because of that, your film is incredibly important, Barri, not only to educate the public, but as a historical record of what these people endured. Congratulations on making such a powerful and important movie.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I felt once I met the survivors and I heard their own frustration, even though, you know, it's a whole other story, but even though they settled out of court, I think they did so reluctantly. And I knew that they never got their day in court. They never got to tell their story. And I also had a sense that if they had gotten to tell their story, I have no doubt it would have been maybe not front page, but it's certainly like the revelations would have been in the news every day, and people would have been exposed every day to the stories and the pushback possibly from the defense. And I think the defense, the state, the province of Ontario probably just didn't have the stomach for that. And I think, but also class action law, and you might know this from your own esteemed background, that it does tend to favor settlements. It incentivizes in many ways settlements. One could say, and you would know more, maybe civil trials do, but it incentivizes settlements because the lawyers often, will work until a settlement and they'll take their fees afterwards. So I think survivors felt that was the lawyers' prime motives. I cannot speak for the lawyers. I didn't interview them. I don't think they would have allowed it anyway. And I didn't want to. I wanted to hear from survivors. I wanted their story to be told. So I think that was very much a motive for me. They didn't get to tell their stories in court.
You were inspired to make this film because you wanted to know more about your two half-siblings, Alfie and Louis. Alfie died in 1973 at the age of 23 of asphyxiation. He was found dead in his bed. and Louis died at the age of 4 in 1957 of pelvic thrombosis. So neither death was fully explained. What had your parents told you about these children?
So when I was 12, around the time that when Alfie died, my dad came to me one day, like that day or the day after, and said, I lost a son. I lost a son today. And I was like, well, I have 2 brothers that I know of. And he said, no, in my former marriage, my dad was married twice, my mom, but before my mother, he had another family. And I document this. I tell this story in the film. And from his first marriage, he had 3 children. I only knew my sister, Adele, who would come and visit and play with us. And I knew her. She's in the film, and we go and tour the facility together. But what he was referring to on that day when I was 12 was that his son, Alfred, had died in an institution. And I was quite taken aback. I was very sad. I was shocked. He said, yeah, he died. He had epilepsy. He was in an institution. He used the R word. We used the R word in that day, in those days. We didn't say, a kid with intellectual disability or developmental delay or anything. He said he was severely compromised, and we had to send him to a hospital in Aurelia that takes care of children like that. I had so many questions. And I said, did you visit him? He said, well, I did. I would try. I'd bring toys, but they would take them away. He wouldn't know me. He wouldn't recognize me. So they discouraged me from going. And he had epilepsy, so he asphyxiated, he aspirated and died, and I buried him. He said, but I had another son too. And he was so much more worse, he said, that he died at 2 at home in his bed. And that was that. I never asked any questions. I saw some photos that he eventually showed me, and he gave them to Adele, because Adele a year later had a son who has the same genetic disposition. So she was doing genetic testing, and she had the photos. So that's all I knew. I never questioned where Louis was buried. I just never asked any of these questions. When I started making the film, I believed that same story. Louis died at home. Alfie died at Aurelia, at Huronia. It wasn't until I started doing the film and researching, and we started looking for Louis's burial for certificates and all of that. And my brother Marshall got involved and said, this doesn't make any sense. They couldn't find any documents. And then it was revealed that he was there too. So not to complicate things on the viewer so much, I just told the story in a way that I knew that both of them were there. But in fact, I didn't know both of them were there until I, was in the midst of researching the film. And I think that goes to, we say in, I don't know if it's Hebrew or Yiddish, we say shanda. I think it was such a shame. It was in those days, and even now, I think families struggle with this, that it was such a shame to have disabled children, to have children living with disabilities, intellectually disabled children. And most importantly, and I'm sure this is the case in Europe and in England and in the US as well, there were no supports directly for families. There were no special schools. There was no inclusion in the classroom. So authorities compelled families, unless you were very wealthy, and even then, not necessarily, compelled families to, quote unquote, do the right thing, send your child away where they could be cared for. You can't do that. And they didn't think about the implications of separating kids from their families, because that's part of the dehumanization, right?
Well, your father was described in the movie as an affable curmudgeon, and you've tried to be non-judgmental in the film about how he dealt with Alfie and Louis. And I think that was very fair of you, Barry, because back then, as you've mentioned, parents of disabled children were under enormous pressure from doctors and the children's aid societies to institutionalize their children.
Very much so. Very
Now,
much
one of the
so.
most shocking things for me about the movie is not only the fact that Huronia Regional Center was overcrowded, understaffed, run down, and under-resourced, and that it was obvious that the children were being neglected and mistreated. What shocks me is the absence of the parents from these children's lives. If they had been visiting their children regularly, they could have spoken out about the mistreatment and done something about it, don't you think?
You would think so, but they very carefully controlled that. When parents did go to visit, they were never allowed on the wards. They were never allowed in in the hospital room or in the ward room or the playroom. I don't even think parents saw a classroom. If parents saw anything, they were brought to a visiting area in the front administration building. So when you see the poster, you see that sort of front area. And so there was a room there near the front office where they would bring the child in and the family would have a visit there. And in some cases, the child would suddenly be dressed up in proper clothes. So families didn't know how their children were actually being treated on the wards. They didn't see what kind of clothing or gowns they were wearing. They didn't see a lot. The other thing that they might have seen is possibly, at holiday time, maybe they were brought into the gymnasium for some kind of an event or a concert or a Christmas, typically, a Christmas event. But usually that was more people in the community who did volunteer work there or, donated gifts that children probably didn't see. So parents were never part of the care. They were never brought in. They were occasionally updated if things happened, usually bad things. Little Johnny Sue or, Alfie got hit in the head, usually not told why an incident happened. And I saw those kinds of medical records. So they were not encouraged at all. And so the second thing, which is spoken of in the film, that even when children told their parents, if they were verbal, see, Alfie and Lewis were not verbal. So even if they were able to say anything, they couldn't speak. So they were the most vulnerable you could possibly imagine. But for those kids who could speak, when they told their parents they didn't like it, or they were being slapped, or they were being abused, typically they just weren't believed. Patricia Seth, one of the litigants in the class action, says in the film, I tell my mother, I tell my parents, and they said, we don't, she said, they didn't believe me. You just want to come home. So that's what would happen.
You used the word unloved in the title of the movie, and we see a cemetery on the grounds of the Huronia Regional Center where over 2,000 former residents were buried without gravestones or markers. Although we don't know the circumstances of these families, it really is hard to avoid the conclusion that these children were in fact unloved, don't you think?
Well, that's why it was called that. I think in my career, I've never wrestled with a title more than I've wrestled with this one. And I sought consultation with survivors. I got their input. I got their ideas. The biggest debate I had was with my brother, Marshall, who's in the film. And he said, don't call it that, because it doesn't mean that just because they went there doesn't mean that they weren't loved. I said, they may well have been loved by their families, but the story is about their relationship in many ways to the institution. It's the institution that made them feel unloved. It isn't that they are unlovable. It's that they were made to feel unloved. And, I think there's only one person that I've come across who took umbrage with the title, who I think may have missed the nuance of it. But I wouldn't have used the title if the survivors didn't fully understand and appreciate it, and many had input on it. And the subtitle, Huronia's Forgotten Children, they wanted the word forgotten. Many of them wanted the word forgotten in there.
Oh no, I think the title is exactly the way it should be. Now, here's another shocking thing for me, Barry. When I was watching the movie, I sensed a huge elephant in the room, and it was this: the community of Aurelia. There were a lot of employees over the years who worked at Huronia Regional Center. Most of them lived in Aurelia, and the institution was notoriously known in Aurelia for deplorable, atrocious conditions. There must have been a conspiracy of silence in that community because no one spoke about what was going on there. What do you make of that?
I think there was a conspiracy of silence, and I think there would have been in any small town that a facility like this was placed. There were other sister facilities across the province in Ontario. There were 2 other institutions, and I think, you know, the larger question is, and it goes to out of sight, out of mind, and the habit of putting institutions in remote locations maybe that, you know, are economically depressed or could use a lift, or, you know, it's what we say, it's overdetermined. So that means there's a few factors weighing in on why that place, why that town. And I think there may have been, I didn't go that far in the research, but there may have been a deal with a local MP that this would be very good for the town when they, many years ago, you know, it's one of the oldest facilities in North America. It was built or it was created in 1876. And over the years, it became essentially a company town. It employed over 1,000 people in a community of, you know, at the time, probably no more than 5,000 or 10,000. I'm sure it's many more now, but it was very much a company town and people's livelihoods depended on it. And then you had the role of unions. And then there was one of the unions that represented the staff. They were certainly into the 70s, when there were various charges that came up about abuse or neglect. The unions would close ranks around staff members. Their priority was protecting staff members, not children. So you didn't have anybody really, it's not like you had an ombudsman for children or an advocate for children who was going in and checking up on them. At best, you had an inspector on behalf of the Ministry of Education or Ministry of Health at the time, going in and looking at conditions. And even then, over many years, they were noting deficiencies. There are reports that were noting, usually around hygiene and infection and safety. But nobody ever, except for one journalist in the early 60s, nobody ever heard about the abuses. There was a murder that had happened, or an alleged murder that had happened, that there was an inquiry. The same year my brother died, I believe 1957, and they found that the staff member who allegedly eyewitness beat this Indigenous boy up. The boy died, he was 17. They determined that it was an accident, and it wasn't until 40 years later that manslaughter charges were brought against this fellow. It never went to trial because he died of a heart attack beforehand. I talk very briefly about that in the film. So, you know, there would be bubble ups of things. Somebody died because they were in a cot cage. They got their neck caught, or somebody hung themselves. I mean, there'd be or disappeared. Someone disappeared. So there'd be things that would bubble up, and then it would kind of go away. So bubble up, go away, bubble up, go away. And what would happen in the community is that they would get very defensive. So when I was screening the film, some Aurelia residents saw the film at various, you know, events and at the festival, and they'd say, well, you didn't tell any good stories. You didn't talk about how much people loved these children who work there. And I remember my dad would take the kids out in his convertible and get them ice cream. And I said, I think you're missing the point. First of all, that's all anybody ever heard were good stories. This is the one big, you know, film right now anyway about bad stories, in addition to, you know, some of the newspaper articles over the years. But I said, and the second thing is, did you ever wonder why these children weren't at home, or where their parents were? Why was it up to your dad to take them out for ice cream in his convertible. Don't you see something wrong with that picture?
Were you shocked to learn that as far back as 1971, Walter Williston delivered a report to the government recommending that these institutions be closed?
I wasn't shocked at all. And I was actually amazingly gratified when I read that report because, you know, we're so used to politicians these days. We have very cynical takes on our politicians. And in those days, we had, you know, some pretty decent politicians who were trying to do the right thing, possibly. And they appointed a very good lawyer to investigate. And he pulled no punches in saying, no one's taking responsibility for the place and this should be closed down. I must say that the journalist who did an article, a kind of whistleblower, Pierre Burton, did an article about 10 years earlier, which was front page of the newspapers here. And that was based on a parent saying something's wrong with this situation. Our child, every time we try and take him back after a weekend visit, he throws up and doesn't want to return. Something's going on there. Even he looked at the deplorable conditions, and he even then didn't know about the abuses. I'm not entirely certain Williston knew about the abuses, but he knew that there was the potential for them. Even so, 1971, the shocking part was 1971 to 2009 when it finally closed. That's a lot of years. It's 28 years later.
One of the aspects of your movie that made it so emotionally powerful and memorable is the participation of a number of survivors who were so articulate and heartbreaking in the way they told their stories. Barri, tell me about the emotional impact on you of getting to know these amazing people.
It's a really good question because, you know, when we make documentaries, there's so many different ways of making a documentary, and I don't want to say there's a typical way, but one maybe dominant way. If you're only, you know, this took me 7 years, but usually a film will be more like 2 to 5 years. I'll explain that in a second, but like why it took 7 years. So usually, if I can say usually, you know, you get to know some people and you kind of take some time to build trust. And then when you hear their story, when it's so challenging, you can be really, really affected by it. In my case, because it took me 7 years, like I first met a lot of the survivors in 2014. And over the course of those 7 years, I heard their stories a lot. So I think the way it affected me was slowly over time. Like when it first hit me, I was very depressed and very upset. And then the more I heard their stories, the more I thought about the film, the more I, maybe as a defense against being hurt, but I would hear their stories often because they themselves became used to telling their stories. Some of them went on speaking engagements. They became very practiced in a good way in telling their story in a way that was not going to affect them badly. You know, so you always have to be careful when you interview someone and they're telling a difficult story, that they're okay. It's about their safety and yours, and that you'd really take your time with it. By the time I actually sat down and had the cameras rolling and was interviewing them, I had heard many things so much. So, you know, for so long, I had heard their stories for so long, and they had been used to telling their stories for so long that the actual act of doing it was exhausting, but it was a reward almost. It was a great relief to finally get it. The only difference was when I sat down to interview them, I had their patient records in many cases, not in all cases. So going through their patient records to read with their consent and permission, to read what little bits and pieces I could learn from it was very revealing. And that really helped me as well.
What was the most challenging part for you of making the movie?
I think the most challenging part was making sure I didn't create what's called trauma porn. was really making sure that I walked a very fine line around revealing enough of their stories without upsetting either them or the viewer and leaving the viewer so angry and hopeless. You know, when sometimes when we watch very difficult films, we can be, ooh, I'm afraid of that. Like I did have a number of people say to me, I'm afraid to watch your film. I said, it's okay. I said, I know. I said, it's okay though. I think we end in a redemptive, good place. And by virtue of the fact that our storytellers are so strong. But I had to walk a very fine line when we were editing, how far I could go in some of the storytelling. And believe me, I could have gone a lot further. But there's a limit to how much you can represent. And it was more important to give enough details and leave the rest up to viewers to imagine, rather than being so explicit and detailed about some of the harms that these people as children suffered.
Yeah,
And then,
I think you struck really the right balance for sure.
That
Now,
was the hardest part. Yeah.
We know that the Huronia Regional Center was closed in 2009. Do you know what's going to be done with those buildings?
Well, that's a very big question. We don't really know. We know that I think there were some like 20 odd buildings, and I think some of them have been torn down, but the bulk of them are being run or have been taken over as a training center for the Ontario Provincial Police. They have their main headquarters right across the road on Memorial Drive, and so it's very convenient to use the buildings as training. So they do lockdown training. They're doing, various policing training there. They use the gymnasium. They use various things, various buildings there. They've got dog training and all kinds of things. So I don't know. There was talk, very ghoulishly, there was talk of turning some of the newer buildings that may have been built in the 50s or 60s, because some of the buildings were built in the 19th century. But some of the newer buildings, there was talk a few years ago of turning them into long-term care nursing homes. And that is very horrifying for the local survivors. Imagine returning to the site of your trauma in your old age. And so I know that some survivors locally, like Cindy Scott, who's in the film, and Harold Dougal, went and spoke with the local member of parliament who represents the area to say, please, because she had said something in the news about it, saying, oh, we're looking at some of the buildings for long-term care. And they made a delegation and they went to her and they said, please don't do this. Please don't do this. They went to the mayor of the town and said, do what you can. Please don't do this. This is just, I don't want to end up here. Again, we should just tear the buildings down. There has not been talk in the last 4 years about this, even though there's been a huge long-term care crisis across the world, certainly in the Western world since COVID, for other kinds of reasons that dovetail somewhat with the film. But there hasn't been talk about it since. So right now it's kind of in the hands of the Ontario Provincial Police.
I know that one of your goals in making this movie was to shine a light on people that are still being warehoused in other institutions like long-term care, group homes, and similar facilities, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much. I mean, I think one of the things that I don't want people to take away from the film that, oh, that was past, that's history, we don't do that anymore. Well, we still kind of do it if the doing is putting people away in institutions that they haven't had a choice in selecting. We do it with seniors, and in some cases long-term care has people in it who are not just seniors, but who are older adults who are disabled, who have critical care needs. And we understand that. Like when I say we, I mean people who are concerned about these issues. We just wonder whether there'd be a better model that involves less warehousing and more humane care and treatment and resources. Group homes are not great in this province. I can't speak for other provinces. I'm sure they're not great in Ontario. There's been many inquiries. There's been many licenses that have been revoked. There's private companies involved, group homes for children, group homes for disabled folks. And I just feel that the same problems 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago of lack of oversight is still with us. Where is the oversight? Where's the accountability piece? So that's what I want people to talk about and push for change around.
So what's next for Barri Cohen? Do you have any upcoming film projects you can tell us about?
Well, I'm working on a few things right now. I'm working possibly on an educational project about women's rights and where we're at on our feminist history, and especially in light of, you know, Roe v. Wade and the striking down of that, and the increase in misogyny in our culture. And so I'm looking at that kind of a project. And then I'm actually dipping my toe into possibly something scripted. You know, I told in part a very challenging or sad personal family story in this film. And so I'm looking at a more kind of almost comedic take on my family, because there was a lot of craziness and humor in my father's life in other ways. And I'm very intrigued by telling that kind of a story too. And it's been, you know, the response to this film has really kept me busy. There's been a lot of community engagement with people living with disabilities and organizations and stakeholders and allies and policy folks. So it's been a busy time talking about the film and getting the word out. And justifiably so. You deserve so much credit for what you've done. I want to tell our viewers that Barri Cohen's film Unloved, HURONIA'S Forgotten Children can be seen in Canada on the CBC television network on Sunday, January 29th. Check your TV listings for specific times. And thereafter, you can see it on CBC Gem. You can also learn more about the film by going to the official website, whitepinepictures.com/documentary/unloved. Well, Barri, thank you so much for making this hugely important movie, which everyone should see, because we owe it to the victims, both living and dead, to ensure that something like this never happens again. Thank you so much for taking the time to appear on our show. Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it, and I really loved our discussion. Thank you. Our guest has been the renowned Canadian writer and filmmaker, Barri Cohen. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver, my management team, Rick and Robin at the Marcelli Company in Hollywood, and my entire team at the XPTV1 television network in the UK. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.